So, this is the 5th video on the Shroud of Turin lecture paper thing that I did, and I am doing these all in a row. So, anyway, part 4 is on the anatomy of the image. The last video was on the carbon dating and why it was shown to be faulty, and some discussion on that, a lot of discussion on that through especially the work of Raymond and Rogers. This video is going to be talking about the anatomy of the man on the shroud, and ultimately saying that it's most likely Christ one way or the other. So, in this section I'll be covering the anatomy of the man on the shroud while attempting to show that the image depicts that of Jesus Christ regardless of authenticity. I should note now that one cannot prove who the image belongs to, but when all the facts are accounted for, we can easily infer that it depicts Jesus Christ. We shall start from the top and work our way down. The first noticeable wounds are those on the crown of the man. They correlate to the puncture wounds that would have been made by a crown of thorns, such as depicted in the Gospel according to St. Mark. And they twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." In reality, the crown is more akin to a cap, thus going against artistic norms and therefore common folk expression. Already we should ask, why would a medieval forger go against the expected norms if he was forging the shroud to trick others? However, this did not seem to stop the people from believing the authenticity of the shroud in the medieval era, but it's still something worth pondering about. Maybe not, but anyway. Moving to the face, we immediately see the damaged nose and swollen right cheek. The wounds here seem to be too general to identify exactly what caused them, though blows from fists seem to fit. This would correlate with the accounts from both Luke 22:63 and Matthew 26:67-68. Now the men who beheld Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" The man's hair is of longer length and fashioned into a braid, while his beard is short and forked. It is worth noting that this hairstyle was not from Greco-Roman culture, but is Judaic. Likewise, the beard was highly regarded as a manly adornment in the Jewish culture. It's also interesting to note the braided hair is something that in Byzantine iconography or Orthodox iconography, Eastern Orthodoxy, has always, almost always been how Jesus was depicted since the discovery of the image of Edessa, which I will go on to say that is actually the Shroud of Turin. If you could just bear with me for 1 second. I have a perfect example of this. This is the icon of Christ from the monastery on Mount Sinai, and it's famous because it was used to correlate the Shroud of Turin to it. And I mean, you can see a distinction or a commonality between the shroud and it. But what's interesting is you see again, this is not the long flowing hair Jesus that is typically seen in Western iconography, but it has the braid as seen, as described, and on the Shroud of Turin. Just something interesting, I think, to note. And icons themselves become more important because there's, as I'll talk about, there's a lot of correlation between the Shroud of Turin and Byzantine iconography in particular. And a little trivia, I think this is the coolest icon of Christ of all time, but that's beside the point. You know, a video's not professionally done when the person actually gets up, leaves, and comes and sits back down at a seat, right? Anyway, furthermore, the face of the man was identified by anthropologist T. Dale Stewart, who frequently identified people's race via bones for the FBI, as being that of a white man whose origin could be either Palestinian or Greek. Furthermore, Carlton S. Kuhn, a highly distinguished ethnologist, identified the man of the shroud as having a physical type found in modern times among Sephardic Jews and noble Arabs. Moving down to the torso area, we see that the body of the man was covered in whip marks which indeed relate to the Gospel accounts. The device used to make these wounds was none other than the Roman flagrum, a dumbbell whip which was usually fitted with small sheep bones and twin pellets of lead. Such specificity has been identified on the shroud. There are around 100 individual dumbbell marks, something that would have been completely unfeasible for an artist to replicate with such accuracy so many times, as Avignon himself remarked, let alone as a photographic negative. And I think that bears something. I mean, all the anatomical knowledge that is, really not even known in the medieval era, but is replicated so perfectly, also had to be done as a photographic negative in a time when that concept didn't exist. The nakedness of the man is also historically accurate, as we know from the accounts of Philo of Alexandria, in which he reports that crucifixion victims were stripped naked before flogging. This seems at first to be a contradiction between the Gospel accounts and the Shroud, as both in the books of St. Matthew and St. Mark, Jesus' own clothes were put back on him after he was beaten. And quick side note, obviously I'm saying St. Matthew, St. Mark. I'm Eastern Orthodox, so I am going to be referring to them as Saint, as this title that we use in the church, just like Roman Catholicism. But obviously, that's not to do anything polemical. It's just how I feel I want to do it. However, we also read in all four Gospel accounts how Christ's garments were divided among the Roman soldiers, who then casted lots for them. Thus, Christ's clothes were stripped off him at some point, again showing a correlation between the Gospel accounts and the Shroud of Turin. Looking on, there is a noticeable chafing of the shoulders, most likely from carrying the patibulum, or crossbeam, on which the man was to be crucified, a common Roman practice. This is reported in the Gospel according to St. John, when the beloved disciple writes, and he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. Sorry if I mispronounced that, and that's John 19:17. There is also damage on the man's knees, presumably from falling while carrying his patibulum. If the man on the shroud is indeed Jesus Christ, this would make sense, as St. Simon of Cyrene had to help him carry his cross, as reported in the Gospel accounts, according to Saints Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. That's Matthew 27:32. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by, to bear his cross. That's Mark 15:21. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming from a country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Luke 23:26. Next are the wounds in the wrists, not the hands. This, as most people can figure, again goes contrary to traditional Christian art, where Christ is depicted as being nailed through his hands to the cross. Now this doesn't necessarily rule out the fact that the man was crucified through his hands, as we only see the exit wounds on the shroud. Regardless, this does not run contradictory to the account given in the Gospel according to St. John, as the word St. Thomas uses for hand includes the wrist area in the original Greek, and the passage I'm talking about is John 20:25. So he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the prints of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." The blood from the wrist also moves in a way that does not seem correct with the way the arms are positioned. This is because the blood is depicted as if the man's arms were positioned at a 65-degree angle, an angle that is completely compatible with crucifixion. Lastly, we'll look at a particular wound in the man's chest, which has an elliptic shape to its top edge. Such a wound could have been caused by a bladed weapon of some kind. Ian Wilson further elaborates. The Greek word the author used for lance in this passage was launch. The Latin equivalent was lancia. Archaeologically, we know quite a lot about the lancia. Again, please excuse my mispronunciations. With a long leaf-like blade thickening and rounding off towards the shaft, it was just the kind of general-purpose weapon that would have been standard issue for the small contingent of auxiliaries who took direct charge of Jesus' crucifixion. In the Lands Museum in Zurich, there are several good examples which essentially exactly the same elliptic breadth to the blade we can see on the shroud. The area targeted on the man is where Roman soldiers were trained to stab, since it was in the arm in which their enemy would be holding their weapon and not their shield, as seen in the Dying Gaul statue, a famous statue of art. Good description, Nick. This relates to the account in the Gospel according to St. John when Jesus is stabbed with the lance of Longinus. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. John 19:34, and I should also mention Saint Longinus. He is a saint of the Orthodox Church. Furthermore, the area in which the wound appears showed a separation of blood parts, including serum. Furthermore, the blood flows on the shroud are surprisingly realistic and again go against usual artistic depiction. The flows followed the natural contours of the body, while artists usually depicted such flows in straight lines of stylized droplets. It is worth noting that such torture techniques was not typical of either Roman practice or that of any other culture, and that Jesus is the only one known to have received said torture. There are other facts we could go into as well as further elaboration on the ones discussed here, but I think that this is sufficient to establish vast correlations between the man of the shroud and Jesus Christ. There is no other person in history or legend that has suffered all these wounds in the same exact manner, and it's this, and the perfect correlation makes it highly plausible to reason that this man is at least a depiction of Jesus Christ. To invent any other character would seem to be completely illogical, as they would be nothing more than pure fiction compared to the person of Christ, who, even if one does not accept his historicity, must submit to the fact there is a long oral and written tradition about him. And to quote Professor Delage, when he was arguing with his contemporaries because he was upset they wouldn't accept his findings just because it was Christ, he said, "But those who wish to attribute the shroud to another person are in the same condition as ourselves with respect to other difficulties, with this difference, that their person is a pure invention without any mention in history, tradition, or legend." So, that is the end of the anatomy section. Don't want to say too much, as the video is already 10 minutes. So, next video, we'll be going on to doing a historical sketch of the Shroud's history. And I hope you're getting something out of these videos. Thank you again, comments, etc., etc.